I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush, joined as always by Patrick Wyman, and we have what I would describe as a hardcore fan's buffet of a fight card to discuss for you today. We are, of course, talking about UFC 191 taking place this coming Saturday, September 5th, and I don't know, maybe it's just the break between events, Pat, since we had such a relentless summer, and now we've actually had a few weeks off since Holloway Oliveira. But, boy, this card is looking really, really good to me. I'm not sure what it is, but I can't complain really about any aspect of it. Now, you did point out before we began recording that some of these fights are in what you call the existentially meaningless category.
There are a few more or less existentially meaningless fights on this card, but there are also a few hellaciously fun fights, a little bit of relevance, and then at the top, just a masterpiece of flyweight, interesting of violence right there.
Yeah, and I would say, like, if you were really looking for the peak experience, you could probably miss the Fight Pass prelims. I like Ron Stallings, who's fighting Joe Riggs, but the fact that he's fighting Joe Riggs in 2015 makes the fight inherently depressing, if you think about it too much. But then going on from the Fox Sports 1 prelims onward, I would say this whole card, pretty much every fight offers something of worth. Collared Trator, guaranteed action. If you like clinch fighting and vaguely technical boxing and people who get hit a lot, then that is a fight for you. And Andrade Pennington, we've got two clinch fighters, two really exciting female bantamweights in a rematch of a fight that was already fun the first time around. Rivera Lineker, I'll leave it at that. Pearson Felder, also an incredible fight. Van Zandt Chambers, and even like the ones that are probably going to be kind of slow, like Blachowicz versus Corey Anderson, they have some relevance, you know? These are people that actually kind of matter in this shallow light heavyweight division today, so it makes it matter to me.
Yeah, I think that there's just a lot to like about this card. It's a well constructed card, and like like you said, even Blachowicz Anderson, which I don't think is going to be that slow because I don't think Anderson has it in him to make it slow.
That's true. Yeah, Anderson is going to push Blachowicz. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like that occurs to me as being a big factor there. But yeah, I think pretty much everything is going to be fun. There are very few fights on this card outside of the deep dark hollows of the undercard that aren't really worth watching.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And so I just want to let everybody at home know what we're going to be discussing today. Basically, we're going to pick out the few fights from this card that are our favorites. First, of course, we're going to talk to you about Demetrius Johnson, Mighty Mouse versus John Dodson, a rematch of what was probably Demetrius Johnson's most exciting and his most humanizing fight since the start of his championship reign. Dodson's the only man we've really seen who's been able to badly hurt Johnson at all. And even the times when he wasn't badly hurting him, he was still knocking him on his pants. So then we're going to talk a little bit about Andrei Arlovski versus Frank Mir, two veterans who are somehow still competing near the top of the heavyweight division. And then after that, near the end of the show, depending on how much time we have, we're going to try to talk about Ross Pearson versus Paul Felder, and of course, Francisco Rivera versus John Lineker, the fight to end all fights. The blood god will have his fill when this fight comes to play. But first, Demetrius Johnson, John Dodson. Pat, overall thoughts on that fight?
Well, I think it's an awesome fight. It's one of the very best fights that you can make in the division, and I think it also illustrates as shockingly clearly as any fight can the eternal battle between a process-oriented fighter and a dynamic fighter.
Yeah.
That Johnson can finish you, but Johnson is damn sure going to win 5 rounds on his way to doing that. You know,
sure.
And then, or at least 4 rounds on his way to doing that. Now, conversely, Dodson is a guy who is almost certain to give away rounds that he doesn't have to give away, but he could end the fight at absolutely any moment in that fight. It does not need to be finishes for John Dodson are not attritive. They are flashes of crazy, insane violence. Whereas Johnson I mean, the knockout of Joseph Benavidez aside, all of his finishes come when he has worn you down terribly over the course of the fight, and you just simply cannot take it anymore.
Absolutely. And he came close to giving that kind of finish to John Dodson. So we know both of these guys are capable of hurting one another. We've basically seen both of them make the other look vulnerable in the space of one 25-minute fight back in 2013. So I think it's a very, very compelling rematch. I've been thinking a lot about this lately, so I will frame your comments about process fighters versus dynamic fighters this way. I think that to best understand the differences between the two, you pretty much have to look at fighters past their primes. Because I can very clearly imagine Demetrius Johnson doing well past his prime, giving younger fighters fits, even if he's not winning, making them work. And I can imagine John Dodson suffering a catastrophic fall-off in fighting ability sometime relatively soon. Because John Dodson's style is built on his speed and his dynamic athletic ability, his explosiveness, these sudden bursts of power, this fast twitch motion. And while Demetrius Johnson's style used to be a lot like that, he is learning and developing into a fighter who no longer needs his speed as much as a crutch. Whereas John Dodson will rely on his speed when nothing else is working, rely on his power when nothing else is working for him.
Yeah. Well, Demetrius Johnson reminds me of not that he has to be at this point in his career, like you pointed out. I mean, he still has almost all of his physical gifts. But Demetrius Johnson reminds me of a really crafty pitcher, of like a Felix Hernandez or a Greg Maddux or somebody like that who uses location and change it and pitch selection to throw off his opponent. Like Demetrius Johnson is very fast, but he appears much faster than he actually is because of his ability to transition. Freezes you. It freezes you for that key split second that he needs to get in on your hips or to transition from punching into the clinch or whatever. Like he gets you to freeze by virtue of you not knowing what's coming next, by virtue of him having thrown you off the scent of whatever his plan is. Like
sure.
I think that Johnson is basically a really violent flow chart, and
That's
a
great way of phrasing it.
Like everything that he does comes with a whole set of options. And the thing is, it's not like these are rote, trained options for Demetrius Johnson where he can only go in these particular set patterns. It's fluid and ever-changing on the go. And he knows this. Like you talk to Demetrius Johnson about his game, had the opportunity to do that on Monday. And like he is the smartest, most self-aware fighter that you will ever talk to. Like he understands perfectly what he's trying to do out there, the various options he has at any point, and exactly what that does to his opponent's psyche. It's like it's stunning to hear him talk about his game.
Yeah, I was talking earlier today on Twitter with our friend of the show, and I hear he was quite flattered to hear himself referred to as such. Our friend of the show, Schwan Humes, and he was talking about basically Jackson Winklejohn fighters. And we were kind of theorizing, and of course I'd still love to get the chance to talk to either of those guys and learn a little more about their coaching process. But we were kind of theorizing why they are the way they are. And people who have listened to this show before will kind of know what I mean when I say about that. We have these fighters who are almost inherently dynamic and rely on their dynamicism. They rely on being unexpected and sudden changes in style and just basically being unorthodox. Like the unorthodoxy is orthodoxy at Jackson Winklejohn. They promote that sort of fighter creativity. And just as John Dodson is the perfect embodiment of that style, or not necessarily perfect as a fighter, but he perfectly embodies what Jackson Winklejohn fighters tend to look like, I think that Demetrius Johnson's a perfect embodiment of a Matt Hume fighter. He's basically a perfect fit for Matt Hume. And that's what's really interesting to me in this fight. Like John Dodson, I said before, he'll probably have a catastrophic fall-off at some point. He's so dependent on his athletic abilities. That is the core of his style that, like Roy Jones Jr., yes, he has technique and he could go on beating journeymen for many years after his career is officially over, the way that Roy Jones has. But if Roy Jones Jr. tried to fight a super middleweight of today, near the top 10, he would get destroyed. And so, we basically know that Roy Jones can no longer do the things that Roy Jones, in his athletic prime, was able to do. And on the other hand, Demetrius Johnson is more like a Bernard Hopkins type fighter. And like a Bernard Hopkins, he's a wonderful tactician. And I have to give as much credit as possible to Matt Hume for having that chemistry with him. Because thing is, I have a lot of respect for Matt Hume as a coach and as a trainer, as a person, guy with great experience. But I don't think that many people would be able to become Demetrius Johnsons under Matt Hume. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I don't think many people would have the same meshing with him. The thing is, Matt Hume will be talking to you in a fight and giving you constant, technical, moment-by-moment updates on what he wants you to be doing. And that is something that would confuse a lot of fighters who did not have Demetrius Johnson's intelligence and his presence of mind and his determination.
Yeah, I mean, Johnson is a smart guy. Period.
Yes.
Like he's not just smart, but like not to insult fighters as a profession, but like he's smart by absolutely any standard relative to any group you could possibly compare him to.
He's like a Gene Tunney. He's one of those guys who stands out. He's well read. He knows what he's talking about with basically any topic he chooses to talk about.
Yeah, he's a sharp guy, and Matt Hume has very little patience for fools. He does not suffer fools lightly. And Hume is also not the kind of guy who's really going to be able to change his coaching style on the go. Like Greg Jackson, for example, changes his approach based on whom exactly he's cornering from fight to fight, right? Like with Rustam Khabilov, I mean, he even did that silly accent. With some guys, he says, like Donald Cerrone, like he's a master of of understanding the psychology of his fighters in the corner. Same with Rafael Cordero. I don't think that Hume is a guy who's really into the psychology. He has his approach and he knows what he's going to do, and that happens to fit perfectly with a guy who's thinking just as fast as he's moving, like Demetrius Johnson is.
Yeah, Hume is like an Eddie Futch. Like he's like a crotchety old bastard who wants you to do things exactly perfect as he says to do. He doesn't want to try to get you to believe in him or get you to have confidence. He basically wants you to just do things right. And that is the way. And for a guy like Demetrius Johnson, he just has the perfect mentality where that's the perfect kind of instruction for him. He doesn't. The thing that's really struck me studying Demetrius Johnson lately is that he doesn't need help being confident. I mean, when I was, I'll spoil a bit of the article that I'll have coming out the same day as this episode. But I'm working on a really ambitious gaps in the armor piece on basically how to beat Demetrius Johnson. One of the hardest articles I've ever had to write, which is why so much thought has gone into it, because he's such a difficult man to game plan for. But one of the things that really stood out to me is the moment. I feel like I kind of identify the moment, probably the same moment that Matt Hume and Demetrius himself identified in the first John Dodson fight, when he realized that he needed the clinch to start taking John Dodson apart. And it's after he gets dropped in the second round. Dodson's coming after him. He clocks him with a huge hook. He goes for a takedown. It's one of the first open space takedowns he's gone for, a big reactive takedown, and he's hurt and he needs it. And he doesn't get it. Dodson sprawls on it, and then Dodson pushes him away, and he just backs off, and it cuts the pressure down. And it's like right at that moment, Demetrius Johnson knows, okay, if nothing else, I'm safe when our bodies are touching. And lo and behold, right after that round, what is Matt Hume telling him in the corner? He says, you're getting in trouble when you exchange at arm's length. He can only hit you at arm's length. You need to be here. And he points to his chest. He says you need to be all the way in or basically all the way out. What we've said many times about outfighters. And from the third round onward, we see Demetrius Johnson actively making those adjustments. And to know that he and his coach both had the presence of mind and this tactical know-how, the experience to spot that opening in that one moment after Johnson was really getting beaten up on the feet is just mind-boggling to me, because there are not many fighter-trainer partnerships who would be able to figure things out on the fly that well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the combination of Matt Hume and Demetrius Johnson can be defeated strategically.
No.
In a strategic sense, I don't think that they can be beaten, because they're always going to have the right plan.
Pretty much, yeah.
If you're going to beat Demetrius Johnson and Matt Hume, it needs to be done tactically, and you need to be ready to adjust as they adjust. Which Dominic Cruz, to his credit, that's still one of Dominic Cruz's most underrated wins. Is the win over Demetrius Johnson, because Cruz adjusted to Johnson's adjustments in that fight. Remember, Cruz, I think lost the first round, or he lost the first or the second round, because Johnson was faster and because he had trouble figuring out Johnson's movement. But Cruz adjusted, and Cruz figured out that if he pressured and backed him up, then if he could get his hands on Johnson, he could soundly out wrestle him, because he was 25 pounds heavier. But it took him a while to figure that out. But figure it out he did. Nobody else has succeeded in outthinking the combination of Johnson and Hume over the course of a fight. Only Dominic Cruz.
Right, which is why I'm really fascinated to see what Greg Jackson will come up with. And on that note, why don't we take a break here? When we come back, I'm going to kind of talk about what I maybe expect to see from a strategy master like Greg Jackson. We can give our closing thoughts on this matchup before we move on to Arlovski Mir. Okay, wait, stop. Don't skip this break. I know you skip most of them. It's a podcast. It's not a radio show. You don't have to listen to the commercials. But if you follow my very simple instructions, you'll be doing a huge service to Heavy Hands, Pat, and myself. First, go to Stitcher.com or iTunes.com. You can use either of those services to subscribe to the show, which makes it really, really easy to listen to every episode and not have to go hunting for it on our confusing, badly designed website. Once you're there, give us a positive rating and a positive review. That means go to the little 5-star thing and click on the star all the way to the right. That's a 5-star rating. That's the best one you could possibly give us. And like 20 or 30 words about how you enjoy the show. It may not seem like much, but it's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. It helps us bring Heavy Hands to an ever-increasing audience, which is just good for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please take the time to give us a positive rating and review. Next time that you're on at your computer, at your phone, whatever, iTunes.com, Stitcher.com, search for Heavy Hands, give a positive rating and a review. Thank you. And now, back to the show. Okay, now I want to clarify, just for a moment, some of the remarks I made earlier about John Dodson being that Jackson Winkeljohn style. This is something that occurred to me when I was talking to our friend Schwan on Twitter, and something that it just really, the idea kind of fascinates me. I think that as trainers, Greg Jackson and Mike Winkeljohn really, really value the creativity of the fighter. The reason I think that is not only because of the way their fighters fight, but because if you've heard Greg Jackson's other comments, he puts a lot of faith in basically the fighter's ability to make decisions, or he really, his whole training platform, as you mentioned, Pat, is built around like cultivating the fighter and just basically helping them be themselves. And so, for example, have you heard Greg Jackson talking about not stopping fights and Mike Winkeljohn? Yep. That's what I'm talking about. Like, even if it's not in the fighter's best interests, he wants the fighter to have the final say. And I think that's kind of how he approaches a lot of things, which is why he's so much more kind of in the shadows, a strategist who just kind of guides what the fighter does in the direction. He lets them design their own guns, and then he just points them in the right direction. And so with a guy like John Dodson, that is both a blessing and a curse. It really only, I think, works for guys like John Dodson. Who are the standout fighters from Jackson Winkeljohn? They're Carlos Condit. They are John Jones. They're John Dodson. Are there any others that I'm missing?
Fighters who have really been totally successful working under him for most of their careers?
Yeah.
Holly Holm.
Holly Holm, yeah, okay. So what we have from these fighters are all fighters who are extremely athletically gifted in one way or another. We have Carlos Condit, who is a cardio machine and just one of the most durable fighters you could ever possibly find. John Dodson, who has Olympic gymnast athletic ability. He is just all over the place. When George St. Pierre was working with Greg Jackson, he was much the same. And we have John Jones, freak athlete with insane cardio, ridiculous durability, and just kind of that mental fortitude that allows him to go through difficult fights. So these guys, given the opportunity to choose whatever techniques they want to use, you can kind of tell that they're choosing their own arsenal if you look at them with that in mind, right? Because fighters mimic each other. They do things they think are cool. There are now dozens and dozens of boxers hanging around the fringes of the top 10 in all the divisions of boxing who are trying to shoulder roll at least once a fight. It's not because it's an amazing, unbeatable technique. It's because Floyd Mayweather does it, and they all saw it, and they saw that it was cool, and that it had swagger to it, and so now they want to do it too. And it's the same reason we saw such a pattern of front kicks after Machida and Anderson Silva got their amazing knockouts with their front kicks, and we saw wheel kicks after Edson Barboza knocked out Terry Edom, and so on and so forth. And so from Jackson Winkeljohn fighters, my theory is that they're encouraged to do this, basically, to be creative and find their own style. For a guy like John Dodson, that works really, really well because of his athleticism, but I think it leaves him just inherently in a hole against a guy like Demetrius Johnson, because I don't know that Greg Jackson has to develop a layered game plan, almost without John Dodson knowing the layers of the game plan. Because John Dodson is not necessarily going to be able to make those small, fine strategic adjustments. His style has not been built to do that the way that Demetrius Johnson's has, or the way that a fighter like TJ Dillashaw has.
Yeah, well, Dodson's game, like if we want to break this down to the most basic levels, what does Dodson do? Dodson does two things. He circles at range, and then he circles at range, tries to find his angle, kind of feints a little bit, but he is effectively rhythmless at this point. It's really hard to time him and figure out what he's going to do. But then he leaps in with a kind of a blitzing combination. Usually only two shots, either two punches, might be a doubled left hand or a left hand right hook, or some combination of a left hand and left knee or left kick. And so it's either the blitz and actually the much sharper portion of Dodson's game is as a counterpuncher. Mm-hmm. So he feints and feints and feints and moves and moves and moves. And then when you commit, he cracks you with two or three shots. That's the entirety of John Dodson's game. He can hit the occasional double leg, but very rarely. I think he's hit like a grand total of 2 or 3 in his entire UFC career. And that's 8 fights that we're talking about there. Yeah. So he really only has a couple of things that he does. He doesn't have a clinch game to speak of. I mean, he can grab a hard overhook or a hard underhook for a minute and kind of roast your ribs a little bit. But he doesn't have a ton of options. So when you have a limited number of available options, it's really hard to develop any sort of a layered game plan because you're going to use the threat of your blitzing left hand to set up what exactly?
Yeah, pretty much. It's basically it's like he's a fighter who's been able to design himself, and so he's done what is like the most fun and the coolest and the most effective. And aside from his bread and butter like that, which is pretty damn effective given the right style matchup, his basics are pretty good in that sense. Then I'm recalling a specific example of Dodson after having battered Demetrius Johnson in the second round. Demetrius Johnson comes out with for the third with renewed aggression, with determined focus to close the distance and get inside Dodson's reach and work in the clinch or take him down. And so the first thing he does is rush John Dodson and try to feint him and get him out of position so he can close the gap really quickly without getting hit. What's the first thing that John Dodson does? A jumping double kick. How is that building on anything you learned in the rounds before? It's just whatever, maybe he won't see this coming. And against a guy like Demetrius Johnson, who is no defensive wizard, but it just he's not going to fall for that kind of stuff because he has no reason to respect you've not convinced him that there's a threat that kind of looks like a jumping double kick, but really isn't, that he's going to bite on it, So he just backstepped and it didn't happen. And that seems to me, for a guy like John Dodson, who has to have such a low level of activity because of how much power and explosiveness he puts into every movement, just like a catastrophic waste of energy. I don't know why, but you can't get a guy like John Dodson when you've been telling him his whole career to be creative and be himself, not to do that. He's going to do it,
Yeah, there's very little sense of the ways in which the various things that John Dodson does play together into a coherent whole. But that's what makes him such a dynamic fighter. And conversely, not to rag on him, but and this is purely a matter of personal preference, but I do not enjoy watching fighters like John Dodson. For me, what makes a fight, and this is probably an insight into my psychology in some way, shape, or form, but I like consistency and process. I like guys that are consistently doing things over the course of the fight.
Well, you know what it's probably like, Pat? It's probably like being a food critic, where if you're a food critic, you can't it makes it harder for you to enjoy McDonald's, even though humans like McDonald's. It's been proven they eat a lot of it. Once you start to really analyze the tastes and what goes into your food, it becomes harder to enjoy it. And so for you and I, because I kind of feel the same way, I'm interested in this matchup because I know how well these two match up. I know that John Dodson, as a counterpuncher, if he can stick to that, is a very dangerous threat for the very aggressive outfighter that is Demetrius Johnson, who wants to close the distance and wrestle with most of his opponents. So I'm interested in seeing that. But I agree with you. Watching John Dodson is frustrating, is how I would describe it. Because it's hard to watch him for the exact same reason that it's so pleasant for me to watch Demetrius Johnson.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, and to speak to the particularities of this matchup, I mean, the counterpunching is a huge issue for Demetrius Johnson. Why? Because Johnson, a lot of the time when he comes in, he leaves openings. He tends to enter on straight lines. Like when he gets it in his head that he's going to come after you, he expects you to back up and not to plant your feet and throw. He expects to be able to chase you, at which point he's faster and he can either get in on your hips for a shot or he can punch his way into the clinch. And so for a guy who's just going to stand his ground, plant his feet and throw back at him has a good chance of catching Johnson with his feet kind of out of position or off balance, or maybe with his chin just a bit high. Like if there's any flaw that Demetrius Johnson has, it's that sometimes when he comes in, his chin gets a little high. When he tries to get out of danger, a lot of the time he'll move straight back with his chin just a bit too high. He'll take like 3 steps back with his chin raised up just a little bit.
Extends his legs, jumps up in the air, makes himself a vulnerable target.
Exactly. And so and Dodson, better than any fighter in that division, is capable of taking advantage of that.
Yes.
That's what makes this an intriguing matchup. But the problem is Dodson is so prone to bouts of inactivity that he's only going to have a few really good shots at it. And the rest of the fight, Johnson is going to fill up with activity. He's going to chop Dodson's legs down. When Dodson can't keep him off, he's going to get in the clinch. He's going to eat 4 or 5 knees to the body. So there's a hard limit on Dodson's chances. He's got if you want to express this as some sort of mathematical equation, the percentage chance of Dodson landing that shot is he's going to have his chances, especially in the first round and into the second. But after that, man, Johnson will have figured out what Dodson's triggers are. Like we talked a lot about triggers with counter fighters, and then again when we were talking about initiative in the Saskatoon card last week. But once Johnson has figured out what Dodson's triggers are, the fight is more or less over.
And there's the danger that because Dodson has not shown much improvement, Demetrius Johnson may have watched enough footage and feel comfortable enough from their first fight to basically already know the triggers.
Yeah.
He's not even going to need a time to adjust like he did the first time around. That is a very real threat because he's shown to be incredibly dangerous in rematches. So yeah. It's a tough one. It's a very tough one for John Dodson, but I still think the style matchup is very compelling. I think to cap off this discussion, we will go to a question from our heavy bag. So here is a sound effect that I, for some reason, feel the need to announce. And our belabored question comes to us this week via our friend James Kimball at Real Mr. Kimball on Twitter. And he asks, it's easy to see that grappling is scramblier, a great invented word, at lower weight classes. What are the main differences in striking? And James, I applaud you on your very appropriate use of a semicolon in that question. Nobody uses semicolons, Pat. Why not?
They're hard to use well. It's easier to just break everything into different sentences and avoid the colon and semicolon game entirely.
I'm infatuated with it. I can't stop myself using colons and semicolons. I guess I'm just pretentious.
No, I'm an enthusiast. But I rarely recommend it to my students.
So I think we can agree with James. If you were to compare at the very far ends of the spectrum grappling from flyweight to heavyweight, heavyweights get taken down and they tend to stay down. And they have a lot of difficulty getting up from underneath other fighters. They don't tend to play guard nearly as often. And they don't tend to be able, as I said, they can't scramble out as easily. So takedowns tend to have a ton of impact. Whereas down at flyweight, the grappling is very scrambly. Guys are getting taken down and bouncing right back up, and there's a large emphasis placed on catching submissions or landing strikes in transitions because there are more transitions than in any other weight class in the UFC. So with that being the case, are there any similar parallels for striking at lighter weight classes, and will we see any of them in Johnson versus Dodson this Saturday?
Okay, so as strange as this sounds, I think down to a certain point, you can watch offensive output in terms of striking increase. Because fighters are faster, I think they tend to be more technical. I think we see more combination striking as we move down in weight. Except by the time we get to flyweight, the guys are so small and the space of the cage is so big, they're so fast that we tend to see an actual drop in output and at flyweight compared to bantamweight and featherweight and lightweight. By the time you get to flyweight, there's just so much space, and it's so hard to cut off the footwork of a guy who's 5'3" and just absurdly fast that we tend to see an actual drop by the time we get down there, and fewer combinations, and more of a guy like Kyoji Horiguchi just leaping in and out of range, or John Dodson leaping in and out of range.
I'm inclined to agree. I was going to say the same thing. You see a drop-off in the combination striking, even from bantamweight, it seems. But, for example, if you were to go up to lightweight, we got a lot of really good combination punchers at lightweight. or featherweight, right? We have a lot of great combination strikers at featherweight who can basically keep up with their opponents well enough to still be able to somewhat plant their feet and throw. At flyweight, guys are moving in and out of range so quickly and so often and changing direction so frequently that it becomes very difficult to get off more than 1 or 2 strikes. So there seems to be more of a premium on pot shotting and on accuracy in single strikes. Now, that doesn't mean that combinations aren't effective, but it does mean that combinations, the usefulness of combination striking is limited somewhat. Demetrius Johnson has proven to be a really good combination puncher when he's got his opponent in the clinch. When he just lets go of a collar tie and he rips off 2 or 3 hard punches right in the other guy's face, he's good at that. John Dodson, the same way. When a guy collides with him and he stands his ground, for example, the 4-punch combination he dropped Demetrius Johnson with the second time in their fight, that was a great example of combination punching. But for the most part, it's these one-off shots, and guys miss, and they just drift apart like 10 feet between them. Massive open spaces between the fighters, much more than you would see even just 10 pounds higher.
Yeah, it's a distinctly noticeable phenomenon. But in general, yeah, I think as we get lower in weight, we get better combinations. We get better technique. We get a higher work rate and higher output. But except with the weird flyweight caveat, I think that also has something to do with how thin flyweight is relative to even bantamweight. Mm-hmm. Like, bantamweight at this point I think has something like 60 fighters, but there are only like 35 flyweights, right? So it's a thinner division. And when you have a thinner division, that changes the metagame. It's a less standardized metagame.
Yeah. The guy we'll be talking about later, John Lineker, seemed like a flyweight anomaly. As it turns out, he's actually a bantamweight, so it kind of makes sense. It kind of makes sense that he doesn't fight like most flyweights. Let's move on from the main event, as loath as I am to do so, because I could talk about Demetrius Johnson all damn day. But fortunately, he's pretty darn active, so we'll have a chance to do so pretty soon again in the future, possibly even before the end of the year. But I want to talk about one of the other main card fights before we move on to the 2 highlights that are headlining the prelims. And that, of course, is Andrei Arlovski versus Frank Mir. And I think I want to talk mostly about Andrei Arlovski, and I think I'll probably piss some people off with some of the things I say about him, because there are a few fighters more universally beloved than Andrei Arlovski. Is that fair?
Yeah, which I never really realized, man.
Fans love him.
Yeah, that's... I never knew that Andrei Arlovski was so universally beloved, but he is. But okay, so Connor, correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but I am not buying the resurgence of Frank Mir. I mean, I am to an extent. I think he's made some legitimate improvements, but I'm not quite there in thinking like, oh, this version of Frank Mir is going to last for a long time at the top of the heap.
No, of course not. I mean, I think Frank Mir is obviously very near the end of his career. I do think that Frank has incredible longevity and has always been underrated in many of the areas that people are. I mean, when Frank Mir knocked out Czech Congo, people were as amazed then as they were when he knocked out Todd Duffy just a few months back. People are like, wow, Frank Mir can punch too? He doesn't just have submissions?
Or when he knocked out Big Night, didn't he guillotine Congo?
He guillotined Congo after blasting him with an overhand left on the feet.
Yeah, you're right.
But he did. He didn't knock him out, but he did put him. He mostly put him away on the feet before finishing him on the ground. Frank Mir has been shocking people like that for a very long time. He's actually been a pretty damn good boxer by heavyweight standards for many years. He wasn't doing that bad against Junior Dos Santos. He just could not deal with Junior's speed.
Yeah, I mean, Mir has long been. I would say I would offer some caveats there. I would say Mir has long been a fairly potent offensive striker.
Yes,
he's got some pop in his hands. He's got good timing. He throws a nice little 2-3 combination out there. He flicks that jab. He can work some kicks. He's a pretty decent clinch fighter. The problem is his utterly abysmal lack of anything approaching defensive savvy.
Well, he's basically on the feet. He's basically the Roger Huerta of the heavyweight division. And he's been around since Roger Huerta, probably since before Roger Huerta was a fighter. But that's, to me, is just like, because Frank Mir is an artifact of an older generation of MMA where nobody thought that you had to learn defense. Like, it just didn't even matter to these guys. You watch Roger Huerta, you're like, oh, as long as he's hitting the guy, he looks like a really good boxer. And then as soon as the other guy starts swinging back, you're like, where the hell did his boxing go? Why is he getting hit so easily and doing nothing to stop it? And Frank Mir is he's very much the same. I think he has made some improvements. His defense seems a little tighter now. Against Todd Duffy, he was pretty reckless, rough and tumble in that fight, but he was slipping and rolling under. He's been getting better at parrying shots coming his way for quite some time. I don't think he's completely lost there the way he used to be.
Yeah, he has made serious, legitimate improvements. You notice that nice little slip and then counter 2-3 in the pocket that he cracked Duffy with.
Yeah, exactly.
That was new Frank Mir. That was new school Frank Mir.
The problem I think that Frank will likely have with Andrei Arlovski is that he has no ring craft whatsoever.
No,
Frank to me has always been just completely willing to fight whatever fight you give him. Because like Frank Mir's never had any wrestling, and so he fights exactly like a jiu-jitsu specialist who can't get people to the ground. If the fight goes to the ground, he's gonna do really well there. But if it doesn't, he's just gonna strike with him. And then in a even larger sense, he doesn't choose his stages with any thought. He has been controlled against the cage more than any other fighter I can think of, and has made no noticeable adjustments to learn to get his back off the fence when an opponent is there. He just kind of accepts it. And so while I think he could actually be a slightly more nuanced boxer than Andrei Arlovski, I don't think he'll be able to do anything to this new iteration of Andrei Arlovski, who, and I mentioned before, I will say things that will piss Arlovski's fans off, maybe a more one-handed puncher than even John Dodson.
It's nuts, right? It's absolutely nuts. Like I was just about to say that. Like off the top of your head, can you think of somebody who is more dependent on one hand?
No.
Than I was gonna say the easy comparison would be Patrick Cote, but Cote was actually throwing his left hand in that last matchup.
Cote has bypassed Andrei Arlovski for technical boxing savvy.
Yeah, that there was a point in the Travis Brown fight where Arlovski threw 6 consecutive right hands.
Yes.
6 consecutive, all in a row. He was lever punching off his right hand. Like it wasn't like there was a gap and then he threw another right hand. It was right hand, right hand, right hand, right hand, right hand, right hand.
Yeah, and he's got a decent jab. He will distract with the jab. He can crack with it if he's pot shotting, but like when it comes to power punches, he commits so much to his right hand that he has no balance left for his hook. He doesn't understand how to put power on a left hook. He will throw it sometimes as a distraction. Occasionally he will mix it in, but it's really like a stabilizing thing where he's putting his left hand on the other guy's face so he can re-gauge his distance or keep him busy long enough to get the right hand to bear again. And, I mean, let's put it this way. Andrei Arlovski is such a one-handed puncher that instead of just learning how to throw a left hook, he has revolutionized the use of the right-handed back fist into MMA, something we have not seen in ages because, for most purposes, a left hook does the job better. That back fist he showed against Brown that he knocked him down with, cool. It's a really cool adaptation for a guy who's had this limitation for so long. But the fact is that it exploits the openings that a left hook would take care of in the same exact sequence. You throw your right hand, the guy slips it, he's exposed, he leans his head forward. You rip your weight back and you crack him on the side of the chin with a left hook. It takes no more extra time, and it packs more power than a backhand.
Also infinitely more defensively sound.
Yes, because it pulls your head out of range. But if you just have a weird phobia of using your left hand, you can just whip your right arm back around and crack the guy in the chin. I credit to Arlovski for figuring out something because he's been having this hole in his game where there's nothing to follow his right hand for a long, long time.
Yeah, it's also the sick part of it with Arlovski's dedication to that right hand is that he actually has a pretty good left. He's got when he throws it, his left hook is technical, it's crisp.
Yeah, it's not bad.
He hits really hard with it. He's got a nice jab too. I mean, it's not like there's something functionally wrong with his left hand. He just doesn't throw it.
In the context of an exchange, he does not seem to know how to throw it. It will just be like a probing strike or a one-off. It does not exist in the context of his striking. Like when he's not thinking, he's just feeling what to do. The left hand has never made itself clear to him mentally. It just, I don't know, it never makes an appearance. Now, I don't think that Frank Mir will be able to exploit these openings, particularly because the other great adaptation that Andrei Arlovski has made as he has moved into old age is that he has become a much more patient outfighter and counterpuncher. Against Travis Brown, he spent most of that fight, except when he had Brown hurt and he was chasing him down, and in which he did get himself into trouble doing that when Brown knocked him down while he was on hot pursuit. So that hole still exists, but all the times that he initially hurt Brown, it was off of counterpunching. And he's not a brilliant defensive fighter by any means, but he's still quick of foot. Arlovski is weirdly undiminished in terms of athletic ability. He seems to me just as fast and just as powerful as he was when he first fought in the UFC, 15 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
And so, moving on the outside and choosing when to lunge in with that big overcommitted right hand and using his smart jab to set it up, it works really well for him at heavyweight when most guys are really slow of foot and pretty damn hittable. So even with Frank Mir's adjustments, I don't think he'll be able to trap Andrei Arlovski long enough to put any of his boxing or what limited wrestling he has to use. And if Arlovski is making use of the size of the octagon, I just can't really see how Frank Mir can get the win over him.
Yeah, it's hard for, again, this is this is heavyweight, and God knows what could happen if somebody connects flush.
I'm about to swear off picking heavyweight fights altogether.
Yeah, it's effectively just a shitty coin flip, but that tells you. Actually, let me bounce this off you, Connor. I'm curious as to what you think about this, and feel free to disagree with me. I don't think there's a weight class where there's less emphasis on ring craft than heavyweight.
Yeah.
Than heavyweight MMA,
which is baffling.
I think maybe flyweight is a close second.
But it's baffling because, like we said, with the grappling, where once you're there, you're trapped. That's kind of true at heavyweight too. Like if you can get a heavyweight in the corner or stuck against the fence, you've got the round almost, Or if you can get him to the ground, if you can control where the fight is taking place, if you have some semblance of ring generalship to your game, then you can do it. And I think that's probably what's been key in Arlovski's recent resurgence, which I have much more faith in than the supposed resurgence of Mir, because Arlovski has been using his legs, his footwork's not perfect, but he's been using the space of the octagon better than he ever was.
There are like all of 4 fighters who actually care about where they are in the cage that fight at heavyweight in the UFC. There's obviously Fabricio Verdum cares a lot. Fabricio has pretty dang good ring craft. Cain Velasquez cares a great deal about where the fight takes place. Mark Hunt is pretty savvy about savvy about those things and always has been. And then like Stipe and Arlovski, and that's it.
Pretty much.
And I would say Arlovski much more so than Stipe. Stipe has had a bad habit of doing dumb things spatially as well.
He's inconsistent. He's had some great performances like the Roy Nelson fight, and then others where he doesn't seem to have any concept of ringcraft.
The Gabriel Gonzaga fight, which came literally right after the Nelson fight.
Which underlines the inconsistency. Yes.
Yeah. And then conversely, at flyweight, you have a lot of guys who just don't seem to pay a whole lot of attention, which partially explains John Lineker's success there, because he, despite not having great pressure footwork, could just guys would get themselves backed up to the fence, and then Lineker's like, oh, here I can just hit you 9 times.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, do you have a pick for the Arlovski-Mir fight before we sign off this segment and move on to the next one? Because I am really looking forward to talking about Ross Pearson, Paul Felder, Francisco Rivera, and John Lineker.
Yeah, I think Arlovski knocks him out. I just think that I have come around on the idea that there really isn't necessarily something fundamentally wrong with Arlovski's chin, whereas I do think there's something fundamentally wrong with Frank Mir's chin. I think he has been hit so many times over the years that I really do think his chin is shot. And I think that Arlovski hits hard enough. I think he's crafty enough that he's just going to put him away.
Yeah, I think Arlovski just had a problem with leaving himself open and exchanging when he shouldn't have against guys who all of them hit pretty damn hard. I mean, it's heavyweight, but I agree with you. Frank Mir, Shane Carwin, Junior Dos Santos, I don't really want to see a repeat of those performances, but I'm afraid that we probably will, especially knowing the viciousness with which Andrei Arlovski battered the unconscious Bigfoot Silva after knocking him out with a single punch.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a guy here in Frank Mir who got dropped by the 2011 version of Antonio, or not dropped, but seriously hurt by the 2011 version of Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. You can't tell me that his chin is operating at full capacity. Yeah.
Sad but true. But I've come around on Andrei Arlovski. Even though I just said earlier how much I like consistent fighters, for some reason Arlovski doesn't frustrate me as much, because at least he's always consistently fun to watch fight. Also, he's got a great beard, so how can you dislike the guy? Look at his visage. It's just so glorious. When we come back, I will not be talking about the makeup of men's facial structures. In fact, I will be talking about two fantastic, action-packed, at least we hope so, and I have little reason to doubt that these will be action-packed fights between meaningful contenders and also between very skilled strikers. That's Ross Pearson and Paul Felder headlining the prelims, and then just before that, Francisco Rivera versus John Lineker, pretty much the main event of the whole evening. So we will talk to you about those two fights right after this. Okay, so here's another way you can help us out. Go to your couch, lift up the cushions, and scrounge around in the creases for change, lint, like bent paper clips, like a thumbtack that you stab your thumb on and then you scream alone in your living room. Throw all the stuff out except the change. All right, now take that and deposit it into your bank account or your PayPal account. Head over to heavyhandspodcast.com and click on the donate button on the right side of your screen. Whatever money you just found, which you weren't using anyway, send it to us, all right? Because Pat and I will use it. That money helps us keep this show on the air and free of charge, which is great for you. It's great for us because that way we're making a little bit of money. The donations are a huge deal for us. So please go to heavyhandspodcast.com. Any spare change that you might have lying around, hit the donate button on the right side of the screen and send it our way to help us keep this show live. Thanks. And now back to Heavy Hands. And we are back. And Pat, I thought we would talk about Francisco Rivera versus John Lineker first, because to me this is not only potentially a little more meaningful than Pearson Felder. I think Felder still has a little bit to go before he's a really legit contender at lightweight, whereas I think that John Lineker, with his experience at flyweight, could be a top contender very quickly in the relatively shallow bantamweight division. And Cisco Rivera, to me, has been knocking at that door for a long time, and probably would have been there already had he not had such an unfortunate turn of events against Uriah Faber, getting eye poked into submission.
Well, Rivera has looked great since he returned to the UFC. Since he got choked out by Ruben Duran and then won a couple of fights on the regionals and came back to the UFC. Since he came back, he's 3-2 with one no contest in there. But both of those losses, I mean, the no contest was a fight where he knocked out Roland Delorme. And then I think tested positive for marijuana afterwards, which ridiculous. But then his two losses, one was a bullshit split decision to Takeya Mitsugaki. I was there for that, and it was a terrible decision. It was bad in every way. And then the really controversial fight with Uriah Faber, where Faber poked him in the eye and then hopped on a bulldog choke. So neither of Rivera's wins, and in a fight that was at worst even and Rivera was probably winning that fight up to that point.
Yeah.
So Rivera has his shit together. He's looked really good. He's really big. He's really strong. He hits really hard. He's a very crafty counterpuncher in particular. He's got a quick trigger, quick hands. There is a lot to like about his game over the long term, you know?
Absolutely. And I think that we have a really interesting matchup with John Lineker, who, and I guess this is a good chance to kind of describe him to all of the, if you don't know who John Lineker is, you're a cretin. And thank God you're listening to this show because you're about to learn about one of your idols. John Lineker is pretty much one of the most frustrating and yet one of the most entertaining fighters on the planet right now in MMA, who has consistently missed weight over and over and over, but has had a very unique style that's made him stand out in the flyweight division. He's been advertised as being incredibly heavy-handed, and I don't know that he necessarily is, but his shot selection is some of the best in MMA. He's not given enough credit for the amount of craft that there is in both his offensive and his defensive boxing. And his body striking, he's got a good jab, relatively good ring-cutting footwork and footwork in general. Just a really effective, mean, relatively hard-hitting, but mostly an attritive, relentless sort of pressure striker. And my hope is that since he's moving up to bantamweight for this fight with Rivera, he will throw a little more volume and may actually become a better version of himself. He won't be so worried about his gas tank because he cut a huge amount of weight to weight flyweight and rarely made it anyway. So his weight cuts were all difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the downside is it's going to be harder for him to get in range against bigger, stronger, longer fighters, the kind that he's going to face regularly at bantamweight. Like Rivera. Rivera is going to have a 7-inch height advantage over Lineker here. That's insane. I mean, especially at flyweight. Think about 7 inches relative to Lineker's total height. The man is only 62 inches tall. Like that's insane.
That is insane. He has a giant head. I think that's really like the bulk of Lineker's weight problems are just how large and gargantuan his skull is.
Yeah, but I think you raised an important point there about Lineker's game, that he gets kind of pigeonholed as a brawler. And that's not, and he is a brawler. I think he is as pure an example of that type outside of maybe Sam Stout as we see in MMA. Like he has no particular preferences in terms of what he's doing. He'll pressure you, but he's not wedded to a pressure game. He'll hit you from the outside. He'll fight you off the back foot. He doesn't really care just so long as he's hitting you, and he's perfectly willing to stand in the pocket and exchange shots. But he's not really a boxer puncher. He just wants to land on you. And but he hits. But I think he really does have plus power. I think the attrition matters, but he's the kind of guy whose fists make a different sound when they hit you.
Yeah, I've noticed it too. It is like a brick being dropped on a stake from 10 feet in the air.
Yeah, it's
sort
a
of
special
wet thud.
Kind of, yeah, it is a wet thud is the perfect way to put it, because just the imagery associated with a wet thud is fantastic. But yeah, I mean, I think Lineker's game has gotten sharper. Like this is, I mean, he remains a violence god, and just a brick fisted or stone fisted, as the case may be, kind of puncher. But there's a lot more craft there than there was back when he debuted and just put an insane amount of punches on Louis Gaudinot before getting choked out.
Yeah,
there's a lot more craft there. He's a much better counterpuncher than he was. He's got a much better trigger. I think he picks and chooses his shots better than he used to. He's definitely a better wrestler. He's got a nice little. He's kind of complemented his game there. I don't think he's going to be able to use that against the guys he's fighting at bantamweight, but he has that. He can do more things than he used to.
Absolutely. And I think the highlight there is his jab, which is not always a consistent aspect of his game, but it's become a very effective weapon for him over recent years, especially as he has faced guys who are faster than him and trying to move away and been forced to pressure them most of the time. It's been a really useful tool in corralling them and pushing them back into the fence. He's got a quick, straight jab. His head doesn't move off line when he throws it, but a lot of guys throw their jabs the way. He times it very well, though, and he works off of it. And that's one of the things I still, to this day, I think of Bas Rutten telling MMA fighters not to use jabs because they're not hard enough to make a difference. And being baffled at how dramatic and misunderstanding that is of the purpose of a jab. That it's not meant to be a power strike. The purpose is to set other things up and to worry the other guy and to bother him and to distract him and to make him jump. And John Lineker does that really, really well. And then when you add into that the fact that he is a great combination puncher, who selects his punches very intelligently to kind of augment what you mentioned was inconsistent ring cutting ability, where he will at least walk you into punches. So you might be able to escape John Lineker, but you're going to walk into a winging right hand to the body or a wide left hook as you move out to the side. So you're going to pay for trying to get away.
Well, yeah, like Lineker, we've talked a lot about the differences in pressure fighting between boxing and versus kickboxing and MMA. And in kickboxing and MMA, you have kicks at your disposal. You can, which are a really effective tool for if you want to be pressuring, because that allows you to cut off a whole lot of space. Lineker uses looping punches the way that most guys use kicks.
Yes,
the way that most when they're pressuring in MMA.
He's got a decent body kick too. Actually, it just doesn't rear its head that often.
Yeah, he can stand to kick a lot more. His game would be more effective if he did. He's got a really nice hard right low kick too that he doesn't use nearly often enough.
And speaking of the kicks, that's one of the major factors that makes me lead towards Francisco Rivera in this matchup. Mm-hmm. Francisco Rivera, first of all, I have complimented John Lineker's underrated defense, but few fighters have more underrated defense than Francisco Rivera, who is a very savvy defensive fighter and uses his defense very well. It is very rare that Francisco Rivera will make you miss without simultaneously bringing himself into range, closing the distance just a little bit, and throwing something right back at you. He's constantly looking to use his defense to enable his offense.
Yeah, would it be safe to say, Connor, that Rivera is one of the better fighters at melding their defense and their offense?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Like Anthony Johnson, who's also fighting on this card. Anthony Johnson is also very good at playing his offense off of his defense. Like the two things like offense and defense are not discrete concepts. They are interconnected,
Yes.
and certain fighters meld them together perfectly. Rivera is one of those guys, but a lot of what we see in MMA from quote unquote great defensive fighters is really exaggerated head movement and parries and the like. Rivera, there's nothing flashy about his defense. It just works. It's just his hands are up when they need to be up. He moves his head just enough to get out of the way of shots, but he keeps himself very centered.
Yes.
Like he's got a really, really solid base. And
I think it's a great comparison to Johnson, by the way, because both of them don't get credit for the defensive savvy specifically because of how effective their defense is. Which sounds weird, but to me, effective defense is defense that is being used to augment your aggression. Defense is its own reward, and so you don't get points in my book if you slip a punch. You get points if you slip a punch and you crack the guy while he's off balance from missing. And Johnson and Rivera are both so good at that, landing that devastating blow, that people tend to overlook the little defensive maneuver that happened just before that shot landed.
Yeah, like the shot that started the cascade of violence on Alexander Gustafsson was a pull counter to a T, right? Like that's not that's not an unskilled move right there. That takes a lot of practice to recognize the signs. And Johnson was smart enough to be listening to Gustafsson's corner, knew that the shot was coming, knew the right counter for it, and then executed it flawlessly.
Yes.
Like that's but. There's a lot to be said for that kind of defensive skill, and we don't see it all that often in MMA. It's fairly rare. But Rivera, kind of a boxer puncher, somewhere close to an aggressive counter fighter. He likes to work off the front foot and pressure you into throwing at him. But I'm a big fan of his game. I tend to favor him here just because I think the size difference is just enormous.
Yeah, and also Rivera has that very Thai style of kicking. He's actually got a really solid Muay Thai game when it comes to his body kicks and his leg kicks, and I think that kind of gives him an edge over Lineker, who he mentioned has those tools, but has too much faith in one aspect of his game to really rely on them. And while I like guys who stick to what they're good at, Francisco Rivera just has a little more flexibility. I also think he's, a little more defensively savvy. It's just kind of like he's close to Lineker in many areas, and just that little bit better. But it's definitely a fight that I expect to be fun, whether it turns into a really tactical fight with a lot on the line because both guys hit so hard and both guys are such potent finishers, or if it turns into a back-and-forth slugfest. It could be either. But either way, I expect it to be really entertaining.
Yeah, it's definitely my most, outside of the main event, it's my most anticipated fight on the card.
Yeah. Now we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Let's spit a few words out about Pearson Felder. Speaking of fights between somewhat similar fighters, one of which is just slightly better than the other in most of those areas, I kind of feel that way about Paul Felder versus Ross Pearson, with Paul Felder being the, just the minutely superior athlete and technician in pretty much, all across the board.
And much more skilled defensive fighter, I think, which is why I tend to lean his way in this. But speaking of kind of subtle, underrated defense, Felder in his last 2 fights has put on a masterclass of effective and almost unnoticeable head movement. Like I think it's some of the best head movement I've seen in MMA. But he's damn near impossible to hit cleanly upstairs.
Yes.
Overall, he struggled with Barboza's leg kicks and his body kicks in that last fight, but Barboza barely landed to his head. I think Barboza landed 17 or 18 shots to his head in the whole fight out of 80 or 85. He landed less than a quarter of his head shots. And
it should be noted that most of the body kicks that Edson Barboza was throwing, and yes, they make a thunderous noise, and you are wearing damage whether you block them or not, but most of them were not technically scoring blows. Felder was actually catching most of them on his arms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that was very, very sound defensive work from Paul Felder. I like the way that he pulls his head offline when he throws. It's subtle. Again, it's not like kind of an exaggerated movement, but his head is never exactly on the center line when he throws. He's really skilled at throwing same-time counters, and he's a highly organic striker. He's really, really good at anticipating your movements and figuring out exactly what you're going to do to him and reading you. Felder reads his opponent like a book. And I got a lot of respect for that kind of game.
Yeah, now the difference here between these two that stands out to me that may give Ross Pearson a slight edge if he's smart enough and kind of durable enough to take advantage of it. Because the big question here is, like, I know Paul Felder can take a hell of a shot on his head, on his body. I know even if he does get hit, which happens rarely, he can take a hell of a punch. And Ross Pearson has shown that he's lacking in that area. But provided Ross Pearson can take Paul Felder's punishment, he may actually have an edge in just being the more textbook fighter, because Paul Felder may have a little bit of that creative fighter syndrome I pointed out about Jackson Winklejohn fighters earlier. Do you recall his almost obscene fixation on throwing spinning strikes against Edson Barboza?
I do, but my bet would be that his coach, Henry Smith, whom I really like. I think Henry Smith is one of the more underrated striking coaches in the game. Also, Donald Cerrone's striking coach. I would be willing to bet that Henry Smith has maybe toned that down just a little bit going out here. The reason I favor Felder is precisely because he's so organic that I think that if we've seen a problem with Pearson consistently, it's that he doesn't really adjust to his opponent's counters. Mm-hmm. That he has a really hard time when guys figure out what he wants to, when guys can time him in the pocket, because Pearson is a very heavily pocket dependent fighter. That's really where he wants to be. Kind of rare in MMA, but guys who have figured him out, Pearson doesn't really have an answer for that. So Pearson had a lot of trouble with Evan Dunham, which is like Dunham stood Pearson up with kicks and then ducked under and hit his takedowns under that. It was similar to what Chris Weidman did to Mark Munoz, though much less violent. So like every time Pearson started to get his up and down movement going, started to get his level changes going in the pocket, Dunham stood him up with the kick. That's exactly what Sam Stout did to him. That's exactly what Ally Aquinta did to him. Timed his level changes with upward arcing strikes and took advantage. Even Diego Sanchez hit Pearson with upward arcing strikes as he was trying to change levels.
And if there's one thing Paul Felder has no shortage of, it's upward strikes. He's got the kicks, he's got the counter knees, he's got great uppercuts. It's not. That's why it's a very specific tactical kind of detail, but that, and then you just add in the fact like Paul Felder is younger, he's faster, he's more durable. He may not have the experience of Ross Pearson, but he also hasn't been crushed the way Ross Pearson has been crushed ever. So he's coming in confident even after that loss to Barboza, where I'm sure he felt like he deserved to win. He has an excuse for himself in his head about why he lost that fight, that it was unfair because he really held his own, and he deserves to feel that way. So I guess it's time for predictions, and my sad one is that I think Ross Pearson's probably going to get blasted in like the second round.
That's God damn it, Connor. That's pretty much exactly what I think is going to happen here. I think that Pearson is not actually all that durable a fighter.
Yeah.
I think that Pearson has historically gotten cracked, made a habit of getting cracked. He also tends to fight at such a pace that it more or less guarantees that he's going to get hit a fair amount. Mm-hmm. And I also think that we've kind of seen the best of Pearson at this point in his career. I think we know he is more or less the fighter he's destined to be, especially coming only a month and a half after his last fight. We more or less know what to expect from him here. I think that Felder has exactly the skill sets to take advantage of what Pearson doesn't do well. I like Felder here.
Yeah, and I like Felder in general, so I'm looking forward to seeing what happens to him after this, which kind of amounts to a rebound win, the way I see it, after that tough and very credible performance against Edson Barboza. So that pretty much wraps up our show for today. Great card. I'm really looking forward to watching it. I hope I get to watch most of it on Saturday. Even if not, I will be watching it DVR'd after the fact. What do you have coming out this week that people need to know about, Pat? Your first article for Bleacher Report went up this week. Yeah,
my first article is up on Bleacher Report. It's a full preview and breakdown of every fight on this card. And then I will have another piece coming out on Paige Van Zandt and the very exciting UFC women's strawweight division, which, spoiler alert, is way, way, way better than bantamweight except at the very, very top, and maybe even there.
I think even there, it probably... I mean, unless you're talking about literally just the only person at the top, and I do kind of think that Joanna Jędrzejczyk is probably better, technically speaking, than Ronda Rousey.
Yeah, whoa.
I mean, not to spit on the sacred cow, but I think that's just kind of the way it is. And Joanna Jędrzejczyk is my sacred cow, so if anyone dares write us an email or tweet disrespecting her, I won't. She'll find you. I mean, I won't have to do her work for you. She's very capable.
Who's got coming out this week, Connor?
Well, speaking of previews, you guys may notice Pat's old Sherdog format being used exactly in the way it was used before by me. My first Sherdog preview should be coming out this week, and just basically because, Pat, you set the standard for previews over there. I'm going to basically do it the way you did it until I get those guys over there at Sherdog to trust me well enough to let me try my own thing. So you can basically go to Bleacher Report and Sherdog and get 2 in-depth breakdowns of the entire card. So if you are a betting man and you want to basically have as much knowledge as you could possibly ask for about every single fight on UFC 191, you have 2 sources now from which to garner that information. I also have, as I mentioned earlier in the show, a very, very ambitious gaps in the armor piece in which I am game planning for John Dodson to beat Demetrius Johnson. It's a tall order, but it's not impossible, and if he can stick to, and obviously I'm not telling this game plan to John Dodson, but if he can do these things, then he has a shot at beating him. Let us not forget, Rafael dos Anjos versus Anthony Pettis, TJ Dillashaw versus Renan Barão. The upsets do happen, and many of them have happened recently. So, that's pretty much it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed the show today. We're looking forward to the card. Remember, if you want heavy bag questions answered on future episodes, then you should... if you want heavy bag questions... I gotta mention Bloody Elbow. I'm getting a secret message from Pat that I'm just inappropriately reading on air. We have to thank Bloody Elbow for of course, sponsoring the show and featuring us on their front page, and I always forget.
Damn it, dude. Damn it.
So thanks to Bloody Elbow for featuring us there. My article about Demetrius Johnson will be coming out on Bloody Elbow, so check that out. And you'll see this basically the same day. They'll be on the front page at the same time, Wednesday. That's when all of our episodes come out. I'm scrambling now, Pat. I'm distracted by your very helpful message. If you want to get at us...
Let's not bite the hand that literally feeds us.
If you guys have questions for us, send them to us on Twitter. I'm at BoxingBush. Pat is at Patrick_Wyman. If you have questions you would like read on air, make sure to tag them, #HeavyBagQuestions. And I think that's everything. If not, I'm sorry. I've rambled too much. I can't stop myself. I have to go with the tagline right now. If you guys came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.